The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid Iowa cocktail of diesel fumes, cheap cigars, and quiet desperation. It was the summer of '76, a time when the talk at the co-op was all about expansion, about planting fence row to fence row. But here, on the chewed-up lawn of a family that had worked this ground for 3 generations, the only talk was of failure. Jedediah Stone stood near the back, his arms crossed over a faded denim shirt, his knuckles thick and permanently stained with grease. He wasn't here for the land, he couldn't afford it, and more importantly, he wouldn't borrow to get it. He was here for the bones, the small pieces of iron that might keep his own operation running. A set of cultivators, maybe a spare hydraulic cylinder off the old Miller planter. He watched as the auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a sweat-stained Stetson, sold off a man's life piece by piece. A low rumble turned heads. Franklin Hayes was pulling in, his new International Harvester 1466, looking like a spaceship that had landed in a boneyard. The paint was so red it hurt the eyes, the cab was a fortress of tinted glass, and the jewels on the back were tall as a man's chest. Frank killed the big diesel with a flourish, the turbo whining down like a dying siren. He swung himself out of the cab, landing softly in pristine work boots. He wasn't dressed for an auction, he was dressed for a victory lap. He spotted Jed and sauntered over, a smirk already playing on his lips. "Jedediah, figured I'd see you here, picking through the scraps." Jed just nodded. "Frank, come to see what the future of farming looks like?" Frank gestured with his chin toward the auctioneer, who was just starting the bid on the Miller's prime 240 acres. "This is what happens when you try to farm a section with a museum piece." He glanced pointedly at Jed's truck, a '68 Ford F100 that was more rust than paint, but ran like a top. Jed had rebuilt the 302 V8 himself the winter before. "The Millers were good people," Jed said, his voice low and even. "They just got in over their heads." "They got left behind," Frank corrected him, his voice full of the easy confidence that only a banker's full backing could provide. "You can't make money turning wrenches on a 40-year-old tractor when I can cover twice the ground in half the time. It's simple economics." Jed didn't answer. He'd heard it all before. He'd been hearing it for the 5 years since his father had passed, leaving him the 320 acres free and clear, along with a simple ironclad piece of advice: if you can't pay cash for it, you don't own it. The bank does. While Frank and the other young lions were leveraging their land to buy the latest and greatest, Jed was nursing his father's John Deere 4020 through another season, its 6-cylinder diesel as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. He knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every quirk in its well-worn transmission. It was his. That meant something. The land sold, as everyone knew it would, to Frank Hayes. He barely had to bid against himself. The crowd clapped politely, a funereal applause for a changing of the guard. Then the auctioneer moved on to the equipment line, a decent 8-row planter, an old Gleaner combine, a few gravity wagons. Frank bought the planter, paying a premium for it. Jed watched, unmoved. Finally, the auctioneer waved a tired hand toward the far edge of the grove, where the nettles and burdock grew thick. "All right, folks, last lot of the day. We got this big old thing. As is where is. Buyers responsible for removal. What am I bid for this piece of modern art?" There it sat. A monster, a Steiger Panther II, its iconic lime green paint faded to the color of a dead frog, streaked with long weeping trails of rust. It was an articulated 4-wheel drive, a relic from the first horsepower wars of the early '70s. One of the massive 24.532 tires was blown clean off the rim, the others were cracked and flat. The cab glass was a spiderweb of fractures on one side. A thick coat of dust and bird droppings covered every flat surface. "Engines seized up tighter than a drum, folks," the auctioneer added cheerfully. "Been sitting right here for 2 years since old man Miller blew a piston clean through the block. We're selling it for scrap value. Who'll give me $100? $100 for 10 tons of American iron." A few people chuckled. Frank Hayes laughed out loud. "You'd spend more than that on cutting torches just to get it out of here," he boomed for the benefit of the crowd. "That thing's a boat anchor, Jed. Maybe you could tie it to your 4020 to keep it from blowing away in a strong wind." The crowd tittered. Jed ignored him. He walked toward the derelict machine, his worn boots sinking into the soft earth. He ran a hand over the cold, pitted steel of the frame. It was massive, built like a locomotive. He peered underneath, seeing the heavy-duty planetary axles, the thick drive shafts. He pulled himself up onto the operator's platform, the steps groaning under his weight. Inside the cab, the seat was ripped, the gauges were clouded, but the bones were there. This wasn't a tractor built for comfort or convenience. It was built for one thing: pulling. He'd heard the stories about these early Steigers. They were crude, they were loud, but they were brutally strong. And under the hood, even though it was seized, was a Caterpillar 306 diesel. Not a farm engine, a construction engine, a legendary motor known for being damn near bulletproof if you took care of it. $50, someone yelled from the back as a joke. I got 50, who'll give me 75, the auctioneer chirped. Jed looked over at Frank, who was shaking his head, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. Then he looked at the Steiger. He saw past the rust and the ruin. He saw potential. He saw acres of fall tillage, a big chisel plow sinking deep into the black Iowa soil, pulled by a machine he owned, not one the bank did. $500, Jed said, his voice cut through the murmuring. The yard went quiet. The auctioneer's head snapped in his direction. I got $500 from Mr. Stone, $500. Do I hear 6? Silence. Frank's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He looked from Jed to the hunk of junk and back again, as if trying to solve a puzzle. 500 once, 500 twice. The auctioneer scanned the crowd, his eyes begging for another bid. Sold, for $500 to Jedediah Stone. A wave of whispers rippled through the remaining farmers. Lost his mind. Threw good money straight in the garbage. Frank just stared, then let out a short, sharp laugh. He walked over to Jed, who was already on his way to the payment trailer. $500, Jed. You could have bought a lifetime supply of paint for that old deer of yours with that money, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. What in God's name are you going to do with that thing? Jed stopped and met his gaze. I'm going to get it running, he said simply. Frank shook his head slowly, a genuine pitying smile on his face. You do that. You let me know when you get that museum piece fired up. I'll be sure to come watch. He clapped Jed on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to feel like a friendly pat, but landed like a shove. Don't go broke doing it. Jed watched him walk back to his gleaming red tractor, the king of his new, leveraged empire. He then turned and looked back at the grove, at the dead green giant that was now his problem. It was more than a problem. It was a statement. Now, before I tell you how Jed got that 10-ton green monster home with nothing but a 30-year-old tractor and a prayer, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever bought something everyone else called junk, knowing deep down you could bring it back to life? Let me know down in the comments what it was. A tractor, a truck, an old tool. I read every single one. Because what Jed did next wasn't just about fixing a machine, it was about proving something to himself and to a world that had decided his way of life was obsolete. Getting the Steiger home was a war fought in low gear. Frank Hayes had been right about one thing: you couldn't just tow it. With a seized engine and flat tires, it was an anchor chained to the center of the earth. Jed spent the first day just dealing with the rubber. He wrestled the one ruined tire and rim off with a 4-foot pry bar and a sledgehammer, the sweat stinging his eyes under the brutal August sun. He took it and the other 3 rims into town, where old Gus at the tire shop shook his head and whistled. The big flotation tires were expensive, even used. Jed found 4 mismatched but serviceable recaps that Gus had taken in on trade. It cost him $200 he couldn't really spare, cash on the barrelhead. The next day he brought them back and began the back-breaking work of mounting them. He used a manual tire jack that looked like a toy next to the Steiger's massive frame, stacking oak blocks beneath the axles until the hubs were clear of the ground. Each wheel and tire assembly weighed nearly half a ton. He had to inch them into place with the pry bar, his muscles screaming in protest. To move it, he brought his 4020, its familiar green paint a stark contrast to the Steiger's faded hide. He also called on the only man he knew who would help him without asking for money up front: his neighbor to the east, Earl Peterson. Earl was a man in his late 70s who still farmed with a Farmall M his father had bought new in 1949. He saw the world the same way Jed's father had. Earl showed up with his M and a heavy logging chain. "Heard you bought yourself a project, son," Earl said, squinting at the Steiger. "Looks like you bought the whole damn factory." They chained the 40-20 to the front of the Steiger and the Farmall M to the back, to act as a brake and rudder on the hills. The 5-mile journey back to Jed's farm took an entire day. It was a slow, grinding procession. The 40-20's diesel engine roared, its governor wide open, black smoke puffing from the stack with every turn of the big rear wheels. They could only manage a mile an hour on the flat, and on the slight incline leaving the Miller place, the Deere's tires scrabbled for purchase on the gravel, threatening to dig themselves into a hole. Halfway home, Frank Hayes blew past them in his pickup, kicking up a cloud of dust. He laid on the horn, a long, mocking blast, and they saw him laughing as he disappeared over the next rise. Jed gritted his teeth, his hands clenched on the 40-20's steering wheel. "Keep pulling," he muttered to the old tractor, as if it could understand him. By the time they limped into Jed's yard as the sun was setting, every muscle in his body ached. Earl, covered in dust and grease, just nodded. "Well, you got her home," he said. "Now the real work starts." Jed's workshop was in the old dairy barn his grandfather had built. It was clean and organized, but his tools were old school, heavy-duty floor jacks, chain hoists, and a wall of wrenches and sockets that he knew by feel. There was no pneumatic impact gun, no hydraulic press, just leverage and sweat. For the next 2 months, the Steiger consumed him. Every evening after his chores were done, every weekend he was in that barn. The first task was the engine. He had to get the big Cat 3306 out. It was wedged between the frame rails, a fortress of iron. He drained the foul, sludgy oil, then disconnected the fuel lines, the radiator hoses thick as a man's arm, and the tangled mess of the electrical harness. To break the bolts holding the transmission to the engine block, he had to use a 6-foot cheetah pipe on his biggest breaker bar. His feet braced against the frame, pulling until he felt the telltale groan of rusted threads giving way. He rigged 2 chain hoists to a heavy oak beam he'd installed in the barn's rafters. Inch by agonizing inch, link by painful link, he hoisted the 4,000-pound engine out of the chassis. The smell of burnt oil and stale diesel filled the barn. When it was finally clear and hanging in the air, he saw the full extent of the damage. A fist-sized hole was blown out the side of the 6th cylinder block, a jagged wound of shattered cast iron. Old man Miller hadn't just thrown a rod, he detonated the engine. The talk at the diner in town was relentless. "Jed Stone's got that green monster torn apart in his barn. Looks like a scrapyard. Heard he's trying to find an engine for it. Gonna cost more than the tractor's worth." Frank Hayes was the lead voice in the chorus. "Poor Jed," he'd say, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's got more pride than sense, trying to relive his daddy's glory days while the rest of us are trying to make a living in the real world." Jed ignored it all. He found a used 3306 engine at a salvage yard that specialized in heavy construction equipment over in Des Moines. It came out of a wrecked D6 bulldozer. The block was sound, but it needed a full rebuild. It cost him $2,000, nearly every cent he had in savings. He hauled it home on a borrowed trailer. Then came the meticulous, greasy work of the rebuild. He tore the bulldozer engine down to the bare block on a stand he'd welded himself. He took the crankshaft to a machine shop to be turned and polished. He ordered a full rebuild kit, new pistons, rings, bearings, liners, and gaskets. He spent hours with a hone, carefully preparing the cylinder liners, cross-hatching them to a perfect finish. He measured bearing clearances with plastigauge, his fingers surprisingly nimble for their size, checking and rechecking every tolerance against the specs in the worn Caterpillar service manual he'd bought. His wife, Sarah, would bring him sandwiches and coffee, her face a mixture of support and deep worry. "Are you sure about this, Jed?" she asked one night, watching him torque down the head bolts in precise sequence. "I'm sure," he said, not looking up. "This is good iron, Sarah. They don't make 'em like this anymore. This engine will outlast us both if I do it right." He rebuilt the turbocharger on his workbench, carefully cleaning every blade. He recored the massive radiator himself, a tedious job of soldering and sealing. He replaced every hydraulic hose, every wire, every fluid. It was a slow, methodical resurrection. By the time the first snows of winter began to fall, the rebuilt engine was back between the frame rails of the Steiger, gleaming with a fresh coat of caterpillar yellow paint. The year was 1977. While Jed toiled in his barn, the world outside was changing. The price of corn hit $3 a bushel and stayed there. Land values, which had been climbing steadily, suddenly exploded. A farm that was worth $1,000 an acre one year was worth $2,000 the next. The papers called it the golden age of agriculture. Credit was cheap and easy to get. The local Production Credit Association was handing out money like it was candy, urging farmers to expand, to modernize, to buy bigger and better equipment. Frank Hayes was riding the crest of that wave. He used the inflated value of his newly acquired Miller farm as collateral to buy another 160 acres that bordered his property. Before the ink was dry on the deed, he was at the International Harvester dealership, trading in his 2-year-old 1466 for a brand new top-of-the-line International 1586, along with a massive 12-row planter to go with it. He tore down his old wooden corn crib and put up a new set of gleaming steel grain bins, complete with a modern drying system and a leg elevator. All of it was financed. The whole county saw him as a genius, a man with vision. Jed, by contrast, was seen as a relic. He had a good year, same as everyone. The high corn prices meant the modest 10,000 bushels he harvested from his 320 acres brought in a solid profit. But he didn't spend it on new iron. He used it to pay for the Steiger's parts, to pay off his small operating note at the bank, and to put the rest in a savings account. He still planted his corn with his father's 6-row John Deere 7000 planter, pulled by the faithful 4020. He was making money, good money, but he wasn't growing. He was standing still, and in the feverish atmosphere of the late 70s, standing still was the same as going backward. One afternoon at the co-op, Jed was waiting to unload his corn when Frank pulled up alongside him in his new 1586. The cab was so high off the ground, Frank had to look down at him. "Still using that little wagon, Jed?" Frank shouted over the roar of his engine. "I've got 2 400-bushel gravity boxes behind me. Make one trip for every 3 of yours." "It gets the job done," Jed replied evenly. "Getting the job done isn't enough anymore," Frank laughed. "It's about efficiency. It's about volume. You should go see the bank, Jed. They'd set you up right. You're sitting on a gold mine with your land, and you're not using it." "It's paid for," Jed said. "I like it that way." Frank just shook his head in that same pitying way he had at the auction. "You can't eat sentiment, Jed. One of these days, you're going to wake up and realize the world has passed you by." He gave his tractor the fuel and pulled away, leaving Jed in a cloud of diesel smoke. That winter, Jed finally finished the Steiger. He'd rewired the entire machine, installed new glass in the cab, and given the whole thing a fresh coat of Steiger green paint. On a cold, crisp January morning, he climbed into the cab, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The big cat engine spun over twice, then erupted into a thundering, smoke-belching roar that rattled the windows of the barn. It was a deep, guttural sound, the sound of pure, unadulterated power. A slow smile spread across Jed's face. He didn't show it off. He didn't drive it into town. That spring, he simply hooked it up to a 24-foot field cultivator he'd bought for cash at another auction. While his neighbors were making 2 or 3 passes with their smaller equipment, Jed could prepare a field for planting in a single efficient sweep. The machine was a beast. It pulled the big cultivator through the soil like it wasn't even there. The rebuilt Cat diesel never lugging, never complaining. He was saving fuel, saving time, and reducing compaction on his fields. But no one noticed. All they saw was the old guy using a cobbled-together tractor while the rest of the world was buying new. One day, Jed was in town at the bank depositing a check. The bank president, old Mr. Abernathy, called him into his office. Abernathy was a holdover from Jed's father's generation, a man who wore a tie every day and viewed debt with suspicion. "Jedediah, good to see you," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Your account is looking healthy, very healthy." "It was a good year, sir," Jed replied. "It was for everyone," Abernathy said, his face grim. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Too good, I'm afraid. I see the loan papers that cross my desk. Men are borrowing sums that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. They're paying prices for land that the yields can't possibly support long term. He shuffled some papers, and Jed saw Frank Hayes' name at the top of a loan application. They're signing variable rate notes. Do you know what that means, Jed? I think so. The interest rate can change. It can, and it will, Abernathy said, his eyes serious. There's a man named Paul Volcker who just took over the Federal Reserve. He's talking about taming inflation, and there's only one way to do that. He's going to raise interest rates, and when he does, it's not going to be by a little. It's going to be like a tidal wave. These boys who are leveraged to the hilt, they're going to drown. He leaned back, his expression softening. You're doing the right thing, son. Your father would be proud. Don't you let anyone tell you different. Just be ready. There's a storm coming. Jed left the bank with a knot in his stomach. That evening, he stood by the fence at the edge of his property, looking across the road at Frank Hayes' farm. A new blue harvester silo was going up, a monument to prosperity. The lights of Frank's new machine shed burned brightly, and Jed could hear the high-pitched whine of an air wrench as a hired man worked late into the night. It was the sound of progress, the sound of the future. He turned and walked back toward his own barn, dark and silent except for the chirping of crickets. He opened the big sliding door. In the dim moonlight, his machines sat like sleeping animals. The loyal 4020, small and dependable, and next to it, the hulking silhouette of the resurrected Steiger, its massive frame and tires casting a long shadow across the concrete floor. They were old, they were paid for. They were his. And as Mr. Abernathy's warning echoed in his mind, Jed had a feeling that in the years to come, that was going to be the only thing that mattered. The summer of 1980 arrived hot and dry. The corn grew to be knee-high by the 4th of July, as the old saying went. But then it stopped. The sky turned a hard, metallic blue and stayed that way for weeks. The leaves on the corn stalks began to roll inward during the day, a desperate, thirsty gesture. Dust devils danced across the gravel roads, and the ponds in the pastures shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. The first sign of the real trouble, the trouble that had nothing to do with the weather, came not from the sky, but from the radio. President Carter, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, had announced a grain embargo. The market, which had been the bedrock of everyone's optimistic borrowing, collapsed overnight. Corn that had been worth over $3 a bushel was suddenly struggling to fetch 2.25. At the co-op, the mood was sour. Men who had been slapping each other on the back a year ago now stood in tight, worried knots, speaking in low tones. Frank Hayes was there, his usual confident swagger gone, replaced by a tense energy. He was arguing with the manager behind the office window. "What do you mean, cash on delivery?" Frank's voice was sharp enough to cut through the low murmur of the warehouse. "I've run a line of credit here for 5 years. "New policy, Frank," the manager said, not meeting his eyes. "Orders from corporate. With the market the way it is, we just can't carry the paper anymore." Jed was nearby, paying cash for a few bags of feed. He saw the flicker of panic in Frank's eyes before it was masked by anger. Frank stormed out, leaving a trail of tense silence behind him. That was the first crack. The second came in the mail. A notice from the bank, printed on plain white paper, informing its customers that as of the 1st of the month, the prime lending rate had been adjusted. Jed looked at the new number, 18%. He whistled softly. His operating note for the year was small, and he always paid it off at harvest, so the change meant little to him. But for men like Frank, who were carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars in variable rate debt on land and equipment, a number like that wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. That fall, the drought-stricken harvest was a grim affair. Yields were down by a third. Jed brought in his crop with the 40-20 and his old John Deere 4400 combine, another machine he'd bought for cash and rebuilt himself. It was slow, but it was reliable. He filled his modest crib and his one small grain bin, then settled in to wait. He had no pressing debts, no banker calling. He could afford to sit on his grain and hope the market recovered. Most couldn't. A parade of brand-new high-capacity combines ran day and night across the county, their powerful lights cutting through the autumn darkness. They were racing against the interest clock. The grain flowed straight from the fields into semi-trucks bound for the river, sold at rock-bottom prices to generate the cash flow needed to satisfy the bankers. One afternoon, Jed was chisel ploughing a stubble field with the Steiger. The big cat engine was pulling effortlessly, the 9 shanks of the plough sinking a foot deep into the dry, hard ground, turning over huge slabs of black earth. He saw Frank's operation at a dead stop in the field across the road. The big International 1586, the pride of the dealership, sat silent. Frank had the side panels off the engine and was staring into its complex guts, a look of utter helplessness on his face. Jed throttled down the Steiger and walked across the road. "Trouble?" he asked. Frank looked up, his face smudged with grease and frustration. "Won't start. I ran fine this morning, then just died. I think it's the injection pump." He kicked one of the massive rear tires. "Thing's only got 800 hours on it. A $100,000 machine, and it's dead as a doornail." "Want me to take a look?" Jed offered. Frank hesitated, his pride wrestling with his desperation. "You know anything about these Rusa master pumps?" "A little," Jed said. He peered at the engine. It was a maze of wires and fuel lines, a world away from the simple mechanical setup on his own tractors. "These have an electronic fuel shut-off solenoid. Could be that." They fiddled with it for an hour, but it was no use. "It's going to need a mechanic from the dealer," Jed finally said, "and they'll probably just want to replace the whole pump." Frank let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, another $2,000 I don't have." He stared at Jed's Steiger, still idling faithfully across the road, a low rumble that spoke of brute force and simplicity. "That green monstrosity of yours still running, I see." "It runs," Jed said. "Yeah," Frank said, his voice quiet. "Well, at least you can fix the damn thing when it breaks." The admission hung in the air between them, a white flag of surrender. Frank turned back to his silent red tractor, a monument to a dream that was beginning to rust. Jed walked back to the Steiger, climbed into the simple, functional cab, and pushed the throttle forward. The roar of the engine was the only answer he could give. The storm Mr. Abernathy had predicted arrived in the winter of 1982. It didn't come with snow or ice, but with certified letters and stark headlines. Interest rates climbed past 20%. Land values, the paper wealth upon which the entire expansion had been built, collapsed. Ground that had been appraised at $2,000 an acre was now lucky to fetch $800. Farmers who had been millionaires on paper were suddenly, terrifyingly bankrupt. The auction notices started appearing in the local paper like obituaries. First, it was the younger guys, the ones who had jumped in with both feet at the height of the boom. Then it began to claim older, more established families. Men who had cautiously expanded and had been caught by the sudden, brutal math of the new economy. The air of quiet desperation Jed had felt at the Miller auction years ago was now a county-wide pall of dread. Jed kept his head down. He sold some of his stored corn when the price ticked up just enough to cover his property taxes and living expenses for the year. He spent the winter in his barn, performing preventative maintenance on his equipment. He replaced the bearings on the combine, overhauled the transmission on the 4020, and fabricated a new, heavier drawbar for the Steiger. He was insulated from the crisis by one simple, powerful fact. He owed no one. The farm, the house, and every machine in his shed were his. While his neighbors were lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wolves of debt howl at the door, Jed slept soundly. The inevitable news about Frank Hayes came in the spring of '83. The notice was nailed to a telephone pole at the end of his lane. A public auction. All farm machinery, equipment, and 560 acres of real estate to be sold to the highest bidder. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a perfect match for the mood. The crowd was larger than the one at the Miller sale, but quieter. They weren't here out of morbid curiosity. They were here out of fear, to see their own possible future played out on their neighbor's front lawn. The gleaming red machines were lined up in a row, the 1586, the huge planter, the big combines. They looked powerful and impressive, but everyone there knew they were anchors that had dragged a man to the bottom. Frank was there, standing beside his wife. He looked 10 years older. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out look of defeat. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. Jed stood at the back, just as he had before, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't here to gloat, he wasn't even sure why he was here, but he felt he had to bear witness. The auctioneer started with the equipment. The prices were heartbreaking. Machines that had been bought for $100,000 just a few years before were selling for $20,000 or $30,000. The bankers, grim-faced men in suits, stood by the auction trailer, ticking items off a list, their expressions unchanging. Each slam of the gavel was another nail in the coffin of Frank's dream. When they got to the 1586, the auctioneer tried to build some excitement. "Here she is, folks, a low-hour 1586, ready to go to the field. Who'll start the bidding at $20,000? Silence. The tractor that had been Frank's symbol of ultimate success now represented a risk no one was willing to take. Too complex, too expensive to fix. Too thirsty for high-priced diesel fuel. $15,000, the auctioneer pleaded. Finally, a scrapper from out of state bid $10,000. It sold for $12,000. Jed watched as the machine that had once been the envy of the county was sold for less than the price of a new pickup truck. Jed survived because his costs were low. While others were paying dealer mechanics $200 for a service call, Jed was grinding his own valves in his barn. While they were paying 21% interest on operating loans, Jed was using the cash from last year's crop. His secret weapon was the Steiger. It allowed him to pull a 30-foot disc and a 24-foot field cultivator, covering his acres with an efficiency that rivaled the modern machines, but with a fraction of the ownership cost. The engine he had rebuilt with his own two hands just kept running, its simple, rugged design immune to the electronic gremlins that plagued the newer tractors. He was farming like it was 1970, and in the broken economy of 1983, that was the only way to win. When the auctioneer finally turned to the land, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the final act. They sold it off in parcels. The 240 acres that had belonged to the Millers. The 160 acres Frank had bought at the peak of the market. The prices were devastatingly low. Finally, they came to the last parcel. "All right, folks, here's the home quarter. 160 acres with the house, the barn, and the new machine shed. A beautiful homestead. This was the land Frank's grandfather had broken with a team of mules. This was the heart of it all." Jed saw Frank's wife, Sarah, finally break, turning to bury her face in her husband's shoulder. Frank just stood there, his arms limp at his sides, watching his family's legacy be dismantled. The bidding was sluggish. A few neighbors made half-hearted offers. An investor from the city, a man no one recognized, started pushing the price up. It was clear he was just buying it as a commodity, an asset on a spreadsheet. Jed felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He thought of his own father's words. "The land remembers." This wasn't right. He saw Frank's face, a mask of grey despair, and in that moment he felt no triumph, no vindication. He just felt a profound sadness for a neighbor, for a fellow farmer who had gambled and lost everything. $120,000, the investor called out, his voice crisp and emotionless. "Do I hear 125?" the auctioneer asked, scanning the silent crowd. 120,000 once. Jed thought of the money in his savings account, the profits from the good years he had so carefully put away. It was his security, his safety net. 120,000 twice. He looked at Frank, standing there like a statue, having the last piece of his identity stripped away from him by a stranger. He thought of the mocking laughter, the condescending pats on the shoulder, and he realized none of it mattered now. 130,000, Jed said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard like a rifle shot. Every head turned. Frank's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. The investor from the city looked irritated. The auctioneer's face lit up. "I have 130 from Jedediah Stone. Now do I hear 135? The investor conferred with a man next to him, then shook his head. He had his price, and this was over it. 130,000 once, twice, sold. For $130,000 to Jedediah Stone. A wave of murmurs washed over the crowd. No one could understand it. Jedediah Stone, the man who pinched every penny, who never borrowed, had just bought his rival's homestead. Jed walked to the auction trailer and wrote out the check for the down payment, his hand steady. As he turned to leave, Frank was standing in his path. The two men faced each other. For a long moment, neither spoke. The raw, bitter history between them hung in the air. "Why?" Frank finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do that, Jed? To rub it in? To finally prove you were right?" Jed met his gaze. "No, Frank," he said, his voice low and even. "I did it because no man should have to watch a stranger buy his grandfather's land." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The banker owns it now, but come Monday, I'll own it, and I'll need someone to farm it. The rent will be a third of the crop, paid at harvest. You can live in the house for as long as you keep it up." Frank stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He looked for the trick, for the angle, for the punchline to a long and cruel joke. But all he saw in Jed's eyes was a quiet sincerity. The hard shell of his pride, which had survived the bankruptcy, the foreclosure, and the auction, finally shattered. His shoulders slumped, and he nodded, unable to speak. He turned and walked back to his wife, a man who had lost an empire but had just been handed an unexpected sliver of grace. In the years that followed, the farm crisis slowly loosened its grip on the heartland. Prices stabilized, and the rain returned. The landscape was forever changed, dotted with the empty farmsteads of families who hadn't made it. But for those who survived, there was a new, hard-won wisdom. Jedediah Stone became something of a local legend, not for being rich, but for being solid. Younger farmers, wary of the banks and the slick salesmen, started stopping by his workshop. They'd come with a broken part from an old tractor, and Jed would show them how to weld it. They'd ask him about rebuilding a hydraulic pump, and he'd pull out his old service manuals and walk them through it. He never charged for his advice. He was teaching them the gospel of self-sufficiency, the lessons his father had taught him. He and Frank found a new kind of relationship, one built not on rivalry, but on a quiet, mutual respect. Frank farmed his old home place as a tenant, working with a diligence Jed had never seen in him before. He used older, smaller equipment he'd bought for cash at other auctions. The two men would sometimes meet at the fence line, talking not about bushels per acre or the futures market, but about the weather, their families, and the quirks of old machinery. The bitterness was gone, washed away by the hard realities they had both endured. One cool evening in the late 80s, Jed was in his barn with his teenage son, Daniel. They were doing an oil change on the Steiger. The big green tractor's paint was faded and chipped from years of hard work, but mechanically it was as strong as ever. "Hand me that 3/4-inch wrench, would you?" Jed said from under the engine, his voice slightly muffled. Daniel passed him the tool. "Dad," he asked, "why do we still use this old thing? Some of the guys at school, their dads have new tractors with computers in them." Jed slid out from under the chassis, wiping his greasy hands on a red rag. He looked at his son and then at the massive tractor. "We use this," he said, clapping a hand on one of the huge tires, "because we own it. Every bolt, every wire, every drop of fluid in it is ours. A computer can't tell you that. A banker can't give you that." He pointed to the rebuilt Caterpillar engine. "When something on this breaks, we come in here, we open the toolbox, and we fix it. We don't call a man in a truck who's going to charge us $100 an hour and hand us a bill for a part that costs more than a good used car. That's not freedom, son. That's a leash." He looked out the big open door of the barn. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields he had protected, the fields that were now his son's future. Across the road, he could see the light on in Frank Hayes's kitchen. In the distance, the familiar chug of his own John Deere 4020, which Daniel had been using to rake hay, settled into a steady rhythm. It was the sound of a debt-free life, a sound more valuable than the roar of any brand-new machine. "Your grandpa taught me that what you own is what you can pay for in cash and fix with your own two hands," Jed said, his voice softer now. For a while there, everyone thought he was wrong. Turns out he was just patient. He put his arm around his son's shoulder, and together they stood in the fading light, the smell of diesel and clean oil hanging in the air. They looked at the old green giant, the boat anchor, the museum piece that had pulled them through the storm. It wasn't just a tractor, it was a testament, built of iron and wisdom, a legacy of survival, standing strong and silent in the heart of the American farmland.